Booktube presents the unabridged recording of Come Sundown by Nora Roberts. For Jason and Kat, the best of traveling companions. Part 1, A Journey. So when a raging fever burns, we shift from side to side by turns, and 'tis a poor relief we gain to change the place but keep the pain. Isaac Watts. Prologue, Western Montana, 1991. Alice Bodine behind a sparse cluster of lodgepole pines, their needle-thin branches offering only the flimsiest shield from the biting wind. She'd trudged through knee-high snow to reach this spot, her boots crunching into the icy crust with every step, and now her bare backside, adorned with the dragonfly tattoo she'd gotten on a whim in Portland, prickled with gooseflesh as the cold swept over her. The wind sighed through the trees, a sound that reminded her of the surf she'd heard crashing against the Pacific coast during her wanderings. She'd walked a solid 3 miles along this deserted back road without glimpsing a single car or truck, and as she yanked her jeans back up over her hips, she wondered why she'd even bothered with the pretense of privacy. Some habits, she figured, were too ingrained to shake loose. She'd spent the last 3 years trying to break free. Of habits, of rules, of the suffocating weight of convention and expectation. But here she was, shivering in the Montana wilderness, dragging her half-frozen self back toward the life she'd once fled. Her emancipation, as she'd grandly called it at 18, had been a rebellion against the ordinary. The ranch, her family's expectations, the predictable rhythm of small-town life. Now, at 21, she adjusted the straps of her backpack, stuffed with everything she owned, and stepped back into her own footprints, retracing her path to the rutted, snow-dusted road. That backpack held her world. A spare pair of jeans, an AC/DC t-shirt she'd worn threadbare, a Grateful Dead sweatshirt she'd lifted from some guy in LA whose name she couldn't recall, a bar of soap and a half-empty bottle of shampoo she'd swiped from a Holiday Inn in Rigby, Idaho, where she'd briefly scrubbed toilets for cash. There were condoms, because she wasn't stupid, a small stash of makeup she'd collected over the years, $15.38 in crumpled bills and loose change, and the dwindling remnants of a nickel bag of weed she'd pinched from a drifter she'd partied with at a campground in eastern Oregon. It wasn't much, but it was hers, earned through grit and guile during her years on the road. She told herself she was heading home because the money had run dry, and the thought of cleaning another stained sheet for some jerk at a motel made her stomach turn. There was truth in that, sure. She'd seen the dead-eyed women working the shadowy corners of too many towns, Portland, Boise, Spokane, and knew how close she'd come to joining them. Hunger, cold, and fear had a way of making just sex seem like a fair trade for a hot meal and a bed. But she hadn't crossed that line. Some rules she'd discovered she wouldn't break, no matter how desperate she got. The deeper truth, the one she only faced in fleeting moments like this, was simpler. She missed home. She missed her mother's quiet strength, her sister's infuriating perfection, her grandparents' unconditional love. She missed her old room with its pink walls plastered with posters, Nirvana, Metallica, a galloping horse, and the view of the mountains through her window. She missed the smell of coffee brewing at dawn, the sizzle of bacon in the skillet, the exhilarating freedom of a horse beneath her at a full gallop. Her sister, Rennie, had gotten married in a big, traditional wedding 3 years back, and that had been the final shove that sent Alice running. Rennie might even have a kid by now, probably did, and was no doubt still as flawless as ever. Alice missed even that. The way Rennie's perfection used to grate on her nerves. So she trudged on, another mile down the road, the worn fleece jacket she'd snagged at a Goodwill in Missoula, barely keeping the chill at bay. Her boots, a decade old and patched with duct tape, slapped against the snowpack on the narrow shoulder. She cursed herself for not calling home from Missoula. Pride had stopped her. Pride and the image she'd built in her head of striding up the ranch road like some triumphant wanderer, maybe even swaggering a little. She'd pictured it all. The ranch hands pausing mid-task, the horses turning their heads, the cattle freezing in the fields. Blue, the old hound, would lope out to greet her, tail wagging, and her mother would step onto the porch, hands on hips, murmuring, "The prodigal returns." Alice sighed, her breath streaming out in a warm plume that the wind snatched away. She knew better, had always known better. That fantasy was a childish dream, not reality. Still, hitching a ride in Missoula had felt like a sign, dropping her within 12 miles of home. Now, though, nightfall loomed closer than she'd hoped, and worry gnawed at her. The flashlight in her pack had weak batteries, flickering at best. She had a lighter, but no tent, no blanket, and no food, just the memory of the last sip of water she'd taken 2 miles back. Camping in this cold, with snow piling higher by the hour, wasn't an option. She pushed harder, her legs aching, her breath puffing faster. She tried to imagine their reactions. They'd be happy to see her, had to be, right? Maybe pissed too, for the way she'd left. No goodbye, just a snotty note scrawled in a fit of teenage defiance. But she'd been 18, old enough to claim her freedom, and she hadn't wanted college or marriage or some dead-end job mucking stalls on the ranch. She'd craved adventure, experience, the wide-open world. Now, at 21, she was choosing home again. Maybe the ranch wouldn't be so bad. Maybe she'd even take a few college classes, prove she'd grown up. Her teeth wanted to chatter, but she clenched her jaw and kept moving. Guilt twisted in her gut as she thought of her grandparents. Were they still alive? She hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't checked. Of course they are, she muttered to herself, her voice hoarse in the wind. It's only been 3 years. Grammy wouldn't stay mad long. She never did. She'd scold, sure. Look how skinny you are. What in God's name did you do to your hair? Alice grinned despite herself, tugging her ski cap lower over the short, bleached blonde crop she'd hacked into being with a pair of scissors and a box of dye. She liked the glamour of it, the way it made her eyes look greener, sharper. She pictured Grandpa's bear hug, Grammy's cooking, a big Thanksgiving spread just weeks away. She'd tell her stuck-up family about her adventures, the Pacific Ocean's roar, strutting down Rodeo Drive, working as an extra in 2 real movies. Sure, breaking into Hollywood had been tougher than she'd dreamed, but she'd tried. She'd lived. Tears stung her eyes, and she swiped them away, annoyed. She wouldn't beg, not to be taken back, not for forgiveness. She just wanted home. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows, and she smelled snow in the air. Fresh, sharp, inevitable. She wouldn't make it by dark. Maybe if she cut through the trees, across the fields, she could reach the Skinner place. She stopped, panting, torn. The road was safer, but the fields would shave off a mile, maybe more. There were cabins out there, too. Bare-bones rentals for wilderness nuts. She could break in, start a fire, scrounge some canned goods. She stared down the endless road, then toward the snow-buried fields and the mountains beyond, their peaks glowing faintly under a sky turning gray-blue with dusk. Later, she'd replay this moment. The indecision, the hesitation, the bitter wind slicing through her jacket as she stood on the shoulder. A few minutes of weighing her options, one foot lifting toward the fields, toward the pines' lengthening shadows. Then came the sound, a low, rattling growl she hadn't heard in over 2 hours, lost as she'd been to her own breathing, her boots, the wind. It didn't register at first, but when it did, her heart leapt. A pickup truck, chugging toward her through the snow. She scrambled back to the road, waving her arms wildly, not thumbing for a ride like some seasoned hitchhiker, but signaling distress, a country girl's plea. No one out here would pass a woman in trouble on a lonely road. The truck slowed, an old blue Ford with rust eating at its edges, a gun rack in the back window, a tarp stretched over the bed, and a True Patriot sticker plastered on the windshield. To Alice, it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. The driver leaned over, cranked down the passenger window, and she fought back tears of relief. "Looks like you need some help," he said, his voice a slow drawl, easy as the country music spilling from the radio. "I could sure use a ride." She flashed a quick smile, sizing him up through the open window. She wasn't naive. 3 years on the road had taught her caution, but she needed this. He wore a weathered sheepskin coat and a brown cutter hat over short, dark hair. Good looking, she noted, which didn't hurt. Older, 40 maybe, with dark eyes that seemed friendly enough. "How far are you going?" he asked, the western Montana twang wrapping around her like a familiar tune. "To the Bodine ranch." "It's just..." "Sure, I know the Bodine place. Going right by it, hop on in." Thanks, I really appreciate it." She swung her backpack off her shoulders, hauled it into the cab after her as she climbed in, settling it at her feet. The truck's heater blasted warmth, and she nearly sobbed at the sensation as it seeped into her frozen bones. "You have a breakdown? I didn't see anything on the road, he said, shifting the truck into gear. No. She closed her eyes, savoring the thaw in her toes. I was heading in from Missoula, hitched a ride, but they turned off about 6 miles back. You've been walking 6 miles in this? His tone carried a mix of surprise and concern, and she opened her eyes to nod. You're the first truck I've seen in about 2 hours. I never figured on walking all the way. I'm really glad I don't have to now. Long walk, and for a little thing like you on your own, it's coming on dark soon. I know it. I'm lucky you came along. You're lucky, he repeated, and something in his voice shifted, lowered, thickened. She didn't have time to process it. His fist came fast, a blur of motion she didn't see coming. Pain exploded across her face, her vision swimming as her head snapped back. She flailed, hands slapping out uselessly, but the second blow landed before she could scream, plunging her into darkness. He moved quickly, adrenaline surging through him. The opportunity had dropped into his lap like a gift, and he wasn't about to waste it. He yanked her limp body from the cab, rolled her into the truck bed under the tarp. Working fast, he bound her hands and feet with rope from the toolbox, stuffed a rag into her mouth to gag her, then tossed an old blanket over her. He didn't want her freezing to death. Not yet. Not before he got her home. They had more than a few miles to go. Chapter 1. Present-day dawn broke over western Montana, painting the snow-laden mountains in hues of rose pink and lavender. Elk bugled through the morning mist, their calls echoing across the valley as they moved in graceful herds. A rooster crowed relentlessly from the ranch yard, piercing the stillness with his sharp alarm. Bodine Longbow stood at the kitchen door, cradling her latte, double espresso, whole milk, a guilty squirt of caramel she swore she'd give up someday. She inhaled the crisp November air, letting the sights and sounds of the morning settle into her bones. This was her perfect start, the quiet beauty of the ranch before the day roared to life. The only thing that could improve it, she mused, was an extra hour. 25 hours in a day instead of 24. She'd wished for it since she was a kid, even scribbling lists of all she could do with those 60 precious minutes. Earth didn't bend to her whims, so she compensated by rarely sleeping past 5:30. By the time dawn arrived, she'd already powered through her morning. A 60-minute workout, timed to the second, a shower, grooming, dressing in her usual uniform of jeans, boots, and a crisp vest. She'd eaten breakfast, yogurt she was trying to convince herself she liked, granola she definitely didn't, while checking emails, texts, and her schedule on her tablet. The schedule lived in her head anyway, but Bodine was nothing if not meticulous. Now, with the pre-dawn tasks ticked off, she savored her coffee and the view, knowing the rest of the household would soon tumble in. Her father and brothers would stomp through the door any minute, fresh from checking the stock and rousing the ranch hands. With Clementine, the housekeeper, off today, her mother would glide into the kitchen, whip up a hearty Montana breakfast with effortless grace, and leave the space spotless before heading to the Bodine Resort, where she reigned as head of sales. Maureen Bodine Longbow was a marvel to her daughter, a woman who didn't need that extra hour Bodine craved, who juggled ranch life, resort business, and a happy marriage without breaking a sweat. As if summoned by the thought, Maureen breezed in, her short chestnut hair framing a face as lovely as a flower. Her green eyes sparkled as she smiled at Bodine. "Morning, my baby." "Morning. You look great," Bodine said, admiring the trim, forest green dress that hugged her mother's petite frame. Maureen skimmed a hand over her hip. "I've got meetings stacked up today. Got to make an impression." She slid open the barn-style pantry door, plucked a white butcher's apron from its hook, and tied it on. Bodine smirked. Bacon grease wouldn't dare touch that dress. "Make me one of those lattes, would you?" Maureen asked, pulling out a massive skillet. "Nobody makes them like you." "Sure." Bodine started the espresso machine. "I've got a meeting with Jessie about Linda Sue Jackson's wedding. She's coming in at 10. Your daddy says Roy Jackson's crying over the cost of marrying off that girl, but Linda Sue's ma's pulling out all the stops. She'd have a choir of angels if we could swing it." "For the right price, Jessie might," Bodine said, steaming the milk with precision. "She's working out well, isn't she?" Maureen slid bacon into the sizzling skillet. "I like that girl." "You like everybody," Bodine teased, handing over the lattet. Life's happier that way. You can find something good in anybody if you look. Adolf Hitler? Bodine shot back, grinning. Well, he gave us a line most wouldn't cross again. That's something. Maureen sipped her coffee. Nobody's like you, Mom. Bodine bent to kiss her mother's cheek, then grabbed a stack of plates. I've got time to set the table before I go. Oh, honey, you need breakfast too. I had yogurt. You hate that stuff. Only when I'm eating it, it's good for me. Maureen sighed, flipping bacon. Sometimes I think you're a better ma to yourself than I ever was. Best mom ever, Bodine countered, arranging plates as the back door burst open. Her father, Sam, led the charge, all 6'3" of him, raw-boned and handsome with silver streaking his black hair. Chase and Rory followed, shedding coats and hats, trailed by 2 muddy dogs. Mind you wipe your boots, Maureen called. Oh, now, as if we'd forget, Sam drawled, hanging his hat. Nobody ate at Maureen's table wearing one. He kissed her cheek. You look pretty as a candy box, Reenie. Smell just as pretty, too. Meetings all morning, she said, beaming. Speaking of, Bodine checked her watch. I've got to run. Sorry, Mom. Can't stay to say hi to Callan. You haven't seen that boy in near 10 years. 8, Bodine corrected silently, furious despite herself. She grabbed her briefcase from the mudroom, bundled up, and stepped into the cold, her breath fogging as she hurried to her truck. Snow was coming, she could smell it, and she'd need to beat it back to the resort,